So, to start the sermon this morning, I would like a show of hands. How many people here have ever murdered somebody? No one's going to raise your hand. I'm giving you one chance. And you don't have to raise your hand, but if I was to ask how many people in here have ever stole something in their life, we might get some hands. But as we continue on with the Ten Commandments, I'm going to combine two of them today because they kind of go hand in hand, about thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not steal. And we're going to talk about these concepts. And it's interesting because you can turn on the news and it seems all we hear about any longer is somebody that has ended somebody else's life, all of these murders and senseless acts of violence that have been happening, or there has been theft. Whether it has been through a business or a family or a robbery, it just seems like a lot of these things just keep getting worse and worse. And that our society does not have a value on these things any longer. So, and it's interesting that the Lord put these together as part of the Ten Commandments to say that these are so important that I'm going to list these out of all of the things that we can list. And again, I don't know if it's a changing of society or not, and maybe I'm getting older and can kind of see some of this as well, but it seems like even video games and movies, all of these things are designed to kind of romanticize violence, to kind of desensitize us from things. I remember when I was a youth pastor, there was a game that came out, and I can't remember the title of it, but they brought it to youth group one day and said, well, can we play it? And I said, okay, well, you can play it, and I wasn't really paying attention. And then when I go into the room, what they're playing is a game that basically they go around and they have to kill people. I mean, that's the game. They're stealing, and they're killing, and they're doing a lot of violence. And it kind of dawned on me, one of the things that desensitizes people from that, especially in these video games, is that when you kill somebody, there's no consequences. Or when you steal something in the game, there's no consequences. More than likely in any video game, when you kill somebody, the guy just kind of fades away. It's like it didn't happen. And all of these things add to the fact that they are making us value human life less and less. And people are valuing human life less and less, as you can see with the murder, but also how we steal from each other. And I think it's telling that it is stranger today for people to tell the truth and to not steal and to not lie than it is the other way around. And what I mean by that is that I kind of noticed this yesterday. We were at a dance competition for my daughter, and there's a lot of people there. And two things happened, and I don't share this to pat myself on the back, just to say that this kind of struck me funny. But we were sitting there, and one guy left, and he left his iPhone on the couch. And there were hundreds of people around. So I picked up his iPhone and I went and found the person and said, here's your phone. And he and his wife kind of looked at me like, wow, well, thank you for bringing that back. I can't believe you actually brought that back to me. And then when we were sitting down, there was a nice tablet that somebody put and left there. So I picked up the tablet and I brought it to a guy that was selling t-shirts and said, I'm going to give this to you, so if somebody comes back, you'll have it. And he kind of looked at me funny and is like, wow, really? You're turning this in? You're not just going to take it? Or I'm surprised somebody else didn't take it. But it's telling that people raise their eyebrows more when you do something right instead of what they expect to happen, which is to steal, which is to hurt somebody, or all of these things. And you can see that in a lot. I mean, I don't know how many people here have ever gotten wrong change. Sometimes they don't really know what to do. Really, you're going to give me money back? I know I made the mistake. And it's sad, this commentary on this life. And it's kind of easy to preach on thou shalt not murder, okay? Because we know that's wrong. We can kill somebody. We can say a sermon in that a lot. But stealing can be a little complicated because there are so many ways that we can steal from each other. There's so many ways that we can interpret what that means. Thou shalt not steal. Even thou shalt not murder can take on a different way. But we rob each other from a lot of things than just material items. We can rob each other and destroy relationships with our words, with our gossip, without being compassionate. We can steal self-worth from people. I mean, you can see that in the political race today. Especially if you're following the Republicans, okay? All it seems is that all they do is spread lies about each other and try to tear each other down and lift them up. And you can see that across, even the Democrats do it. I'm just saying that you turn on the television and this is the example we are giving to people. This is the norm. So when our kids watch television and look at the leaders of our country doing that, what hope do we really have? But God says we can be the difference makers. God says, understand what I am calling you to do and why it is important to value human life and human relationships instead of breaking them. Because again, when we steal, when we murder in a lot of those different ways, we break and we hurt relationships. Our relationships with each other, but more than that, we hurt our relationship with God. We steal our relationship from God, and it drives a wedge in between there. You know, Proverbs 12:22 talks about lying, and it says in there that lying is an abomination. So for those of us in there that like to use verses that talk about abominations, we're all abominations. You know, we are all falling short of what God is calling us to do. But God says this is so important to the life of each other and how we build each other up, that I do not look on lying and gossip and all of these things lightly. You know, some translations in that Proverbs verse says that it is detestable to God, that God hates that, and uses this harsh language to help us understand why it's important. But again, we live in a society that does not value those relationships anymore. We do not value each other any longer. We kind of dehumanize people. And it's very easy for us to do that when we think that we are within the scope of God and other people are outside the scope of God. That's one of the reasons, again, like thinking about the Crusades and all of these things that have happened within the church's history and the violence and even war today. When you are fighting an enemy, you are basically saying that I am inside of the circle. I am inside the presence of God, and you are outside the presence of God. And why do we say that? Is because it is very easy for us to say, well, they are outside the presence of God and the compassion of God, therefore they are expendable, and I can kill them or steal from them because they are outside of that. Now, that is not the truth at all. We are all inside. We are all children of God. But it helps us to kind of hush people and kind of not have to care for people when we think that we're in and they are out. And you can see that throughout history. They are fighting against God. I'm fighting for God. So it is okay, and God understands this. But yet God still says, thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. There's no qualifiers on that. Thou shalt not murder. Well, you could kill these type of people. Thou shalt not steal. Well, you can steal from these type of people. That's not how it works, people. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. But again, people do it. And again, you can turn on the news and see that people steal and kill for very little reasons. You know, I can remember a year ago or so, there was a thing in the news about a guy that was killed in the subway. And he was waiting for the subway, and two guys went up and killed him for the money that he had in his pocket. He had $5 in his pocket. That's how much life was worth to these people, that they got $5. Or again, you can, and I don't mean to be political, because this goes on both the left and the right of things, okay? So everybody is included. But you can hear the rhetoric that people spew about, well, we are God's people. These people are the Muslims or Islam. They are not. So we have to reclaim this for God. And all of this language that clearly says we are the right and they are the wrong. That is another way that God says you are murdering people and you are stealing from people because you are hindering this relationship that they can have with God. How we speak to each other, how we talk about each other, how we gossip about each other. All of these things rob us of that value of life that God says is so precious. And sometimes people steal just to steal. You know, I read this great little clip that said there's a taxi driver in New York that just wanted to see what would happen. So every time he would take his trash, his literal garbage out, he would put the garbage bag in the back of the taxi seat. And it never failed. By the end of the night, that garbage bag was not there. And he would always say he just would laugh because he had to think that these people were thinking they were stealing something very special, but yet they got nothing but garbage. People steal, and they do not value things like that. And again, this idea of stealing and murder and these commandments, they have more to do with our relationships with each other than they do ourselves. You know, it really has nothing to do with, well, it does have something to do, but it's not the main idea that God is trying to get across, that yes, you steal and it's my relationship with God and I got to deal with the punishments and all of this. It has more to do with the fact that God is not happy because I broke a relationship. And I'm thinking about sin lately. And I'm doing my own study on the concept of sin. And the more I read and the more I understand what God is saying and why sin is so important to God. And I'm studying this because I don't like to talk about sin that much, because I'd much rather talk about the love and the compassion and the grace of God, which is very important. But sin plays a part. And the idea and why sin is so important to God isn't about having a laundry list of things that when I get to heaven, God says, okay, John, you swore on this date and you did this and you did that, and let's see if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is God's going to say, yes, John, you made some bad choices and you sinned, and you know why it's important to me? Is because you broke relationships. Sin becomes sin when it hinders our relationships with each other. Okay, when it affects somebody else other than me. And when we steal, when we kill, we are breaking relationships. This concept that God says life is so valuable and each and every one is worthy of God. How are we doing that with that this morning? You know, and I kept thinking about murdering and stealing and how they tie in. And I know I've mentioned this before, but when I was in graduate school at seminary, we had a professor, and it was my mentor and all of that, and he was this very staunch pacifist, and him and I would kind of talk about that and differ on some things. But I loved how he explained something one time, and it has always stuck with me. He says, for him, why he thinks it is wrong, even in war, to kill people is because it steals a person's chance with God. It makes them all of a sudden not have that opportunity for a right relationship with God. And then not only does it steal that relationship from God, it also steals our relationship from God and drives a wedge between us and the Lord. And this concept of stealing from God came up in my head. And you're thinking, well, how can you possibly steal from God? Really, you think God's really up there thinking that I'm stealing something from God? You are right. I believe that. I believe that we steal from God all of the time in the form of my own relationship with God, because that is what God is calling us to. And we're talking about renewing ourselves. God says, come, be a part of this. Have this relationship. But if I am stealing from each other, if I am killing my brothers and my sisters, if I'm doing all of these things that is driving a wedge between my relationship with each other and my relationship with God, how in the world am I going to have a good relationship with the divine? I can't. I cannot be right with God if my relationships are not right with my sisters and my brothers, which is very tough. Because there are just some people where you want to say, you know what, God, they don't count. But they do. And God says, before you can have a good relationship with me, you better fix these relationships with each other. Because if it's broken, it needs repaired. You know, we don't do confession anymore. You know, I remember growing up Catholic, we had to go to confession. And there is something therapeutic about that because you can acknowledge, all right, this is where it's broken. This is where it broke down. And what can I do to restore myself to God and to each other? And a lot of people always want to say, okay, John, okay, Pastor, I don't feel God. I can't hear the voice of God. And part of me has to say, okay, there's a reason for that. And I can't hear God or feel the presence of God because I have other things that are in the way. Because I have these broken relationships that are hindering my relationship with God. We're not connected to God. And again, we steal these opportunities from people. That's why it is so important to God about our witness and about our lives and how we carry on and how we talk about each other and the image that we show. Because it is through us oftentimes that somebody can feel a connection to God. And if they don't see the true God, if they see this distorted view that I have, oftentimes they just want nothing to do with God. So again, I steal an opportunity from somebody because I'm being selfish or because I'm painting God in a different way than what God needs to do. I've said this before and I believe it, okay? And you'll hear it for the next, until I am no longer here. Our actions, my actions, do one of two things. Bring people closer to God or further away from God. I have found in the last almost 20 years of ministry that there's really no in between on those things. Either we enhance people's relationships or we destroy them. Either I help somebody see God and want to be a part of God and enter into the presence of God, or because of my actions, they just say, I don't need God. That's how important these things are and why God says, pay attention to what you're doing. Pay attention to how your words hurt. Pay attention to how you treat strangers, how you treat each other. Pay attention because this is so important. And again, as we talk about the Ten Commandments, almost all the commentaries and all of the books I read on the Ten Commandments lead back to the fact that it is about a relationship with God and a relationship with each other. That is it. Matthew 25. When we stand in judgment, however that will look, it will have nothing to do with a scale on there that says, okay, John, you've sinned X amount of times in this. It has nothing to do with that. If you remember what Matthew 25 states, Jesus says, these are the things that you will be asked. These are the things that you will have to give an account for. And they had nothing to do with all of these little things that we make sin into, and everything to do with how we treated each other. Did you clothe somebody? Did you give somebody some food? Did you give somebody something to drink? Did you go and visit them when they needed to be visited, when they were sick or in prison? All of those things is because of our relationships. And if we break them, we break our relationship with God. Again, that is why when we talk about communion, and next week we're going to take a break from the Ten Commandments and talk about love feast next week, because that's coming up. And this idea of communion and why it is so important, because Jesus says it, and then also Paul says it, that if we come to communion, we better have our relationships right with each other. Because if I don't have my right relationships with each other, I better not come to the altar of God. So in order for me to be able to come to God and to fix my relationship with God and renew myself before God, I have to make sure my relationships are okay. I have to start that healing process. And I don't know how all that looks. Relationships are messy. Life is messy. I know that we fall and we get angered and relationships are broken. But Paul says, as far as it depends on you, work for peace. As far as it depends on you, try to right this relationship. Because Paul knew, Christ knew, that if I do not foster those and build those relationships up with my sisters and my brothers, there is no hope for me to have the right relationship with God. They go hand in hand. And I will tell you, okay, that if you tell me that nope, that is not true, that I can have a great relationship with God and I don't have to worry about my relationships with each other, I will tell you, you are wrong. There's no getting around that, whether we like that or not. We don't have to agree with each other, but we have to respect each other and build each other up and understand that all of us deserve God. You know, you read in the paper a lot, and you've seen this in those Trump rallies with the Black Lives Matter. People are upset. And people are upset, not necessarily because they are Republican or Democrat. People are upset because people do not value lives anymore. My problem with the Black Lives Matter thing isn't that I don't agree with that. It just should be that all lives matter. And I think you've heard that. It shouldn't matter if we are white, black, yellow, green, orange, a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim. All of us, whether we like it or not, are in this circle with God. All of us are worth relationships with each other. Do we value that? Do we understand that? Or do we put stipulations on it? Well, I can have a right relationship, but they ought to meet this criteria. That's not what we're called to do. But when we don't foster that, we are stealing from ourselves and from God. Again, how are you doing with this? And I just want you to wrestle with this in your own lives. Where are things broken? What needs attention? Maybe God's speaking to you as far as a relationship or something that you need to do. But ask yourself, if I am not where I want to be with God, if my life is not where it needs to be with this holy mystery that we call God, maybe it's because I'm falling short in some other ways, and I'm hurting my sisters and my brothers. We are called to a higher standard. We cannot get away from that. Whether we preach judgment or whether we preach grace, either way, we can't get away from the fact that we have responsibility. And our responsibility is nothing more than to love God and to love each other. And if we don't do that, we are guilty of breaking these commandments. Because again, this was important to God to put on those tablets. You know, for a split second there, my mind went and I said, why did God have an iPad? But the tablets I meant were the stone tablets. See how my mind works sometimes. Important. Think about that. I mean, God could have chose anything to put on those, to list in those 10 things. And we could probably think of other things that we say, well, God should have put this on the 10 commandments or that. But honestly, if you really think about what is listed there, everything that we can possibly think of falls under one of those commandments. Because God said our relationships matter. And it starts with us. It starts with me realizing that, first of all, I can't fix a relationship unless I have God with me. And I know I've talked about that before, especially about loving people, because sometimes people are hard to love. Some people just rub you the wrong way, or somebody is so at odds with your beliefs that you don't understand how you can possibly be linked together. But it's important. And God says, build those, because you are worth God. I am worth God. Love God, love each other. And if you don't, we are guilty of murder and we are guilty of stealing. And I know some of you are probably thinking, that is not murder. Again, I would disagree with you. When I kill a relationship, when I kill somebody's idea of God because I think that I have the answers, we are just as guilty as anybody else. It's that important. You know, as we think about these commandments, I'm trying to get you to see them in a different light. Because again, oh yeah, don't steal, don't murder. But they're so much deeper, so much more important than just those words. They need to be unpacked so we can understand why they were so important to God that God said, here are the 10 things. Here are the 10 things. If you do these, you will live well. If you do these, you will be in right relationships with each other and with God. Where are you this morning? I don't know, and I can't answer that. I got my own demons. I got my own issues of how I hurt and how I steal from people. But we need to try. You know, that's what I think God is looking for us. I don't know how many people here watched the new series that was on ABC or NBC called Kings and Prophets. It's a story about David's life, and it was very well done. I recommend you tuning into that. And it's kind of interesting, too, because it's showing people an aspect of God that hasn't been seen in a while as far as on television and making people think about it. But I have this love relationship with David because David sinned a lot. He was probably one of the most notorious sinners in the Bible. A murderer, a cheat, all of these things. But yet, the Bible says that he was God's favorite. And why was he God's favorite? Well, one of the reasons was because David tried. And David said, yes, I messed up. But I need to try a little bit. I need to refix these things. And some, he failed at, and some he succeeded at. But David's heart was there that said, this is worth something bigger than this. That is what God is looking for. Not that we are perfect. Not that we are blameless or sinless. God knows we are broken and we are human. What God wants is this heart that says, I am going to try and I'm going to make this relationship important. And if this relationship is important, if I can enter into the presence of God, that will help me make sure that other people are seen as worthy as well. Human lives. Again, we are living in a crazy time. We are, in my opinion, watching history be made with what is going on in our world today. With the hurt and the violence and all of these things. Can we make a difference and show people another way? That's what this is all about. That's what these commandments are all about. That's what the reading the Bible is all about. That is why we come here, so that we can show people a better way. A better way. Let us pray. Lord, be with us. Whether we want to admit or not that we are thieves and murderers, whether we want to justify why we don't like somebody, or we can justify why our relationship is not right with you. Help us to look deeply within ourselves today. Help us to look at how we are doing with our relationships with each other. Do we value each other? See the sacredness in each other. Safeguard life with each other. Help us to understand that this is so much bigger than just those small little issues. That we need to build and repair each other so that we can come to you blameless and say, here I am, God. Build us up. So as we continue to understand what renewal is about, and as we continue to come and be in your presence, Help us to be your hands and your feet, and help us to build relationships up. Regardless if we agree or disagree, we can love. So be with us as we live within the messiness of life. Just walk with us. And all of God's people said, if you'll please stand as we close the service. This place and we go on with our lives. May we ask the Lord to dwell with us and understand that what is within this gives us the key to right relationships. So as we bring that light out, may that light fill us and help us to interact with each other in loving and healthy ways. And all of God's people said,